I guess we can start. I am Guia Gilardoni. I'm very pleased to be here today chairing this second anti-racism webinar of the anti-racist working group from IMISCOE. So thank IMISCOE, thank you, thanks to Parvati Raghuram, who is the chair of this nice working group, and to Marco Martiniello, who unfortunately today is not with us, but brings his wishes to all the attendees. So as I was mentioned, this is the second of 3 webinar series, and we would like to inform you that the webinar is recorded. So if you, and will be available on the IMISCO website. So if you don't like to be on the screen, please cut out your camera. We are going to have 2 sections today. The first is a debate between experts from Hungary and Poland, and this will take the first hour, and then we will move to the experts from Sweden and Switzerland. At the end of each section, we are happy to gather the questions from the audience. So please, you can or write in the chat or just raise your hands, and then we will have hopefully a sort of lively debate. Because our idea is exactly to promote debate among scholars from different countries, promoting this exchange among different national perspective and national situation around Europe. Before introducing the speakers, let me mention some of safer space rules that we would like to share with you. So this is an event discrimination-free and harassment-free zone. Please respect and listen to the others. Please do not make assumptions about other people's gender, sexuality, nationality, ethnicity, race, religion, or other personal matters. Be open to discuss with others and to new perspectives. I'm sure you are. And if you disagree with someone, please raise the matter in a constructive way so that we can address it in a friendly manner. Thanks for this. And so we will start with Monica Bobako. She is an associate professor at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland. She holds PhD as well as habilitation in philosophy. And her areas of specialization include political anthropology, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and religious studies, with a special focus on Islam as well as gender. And Monica will debate with Zsuzsa Vidra. Zsuzsanna Vidra is a research fellow at the Center for Policy Studies, Central European University, Hungary. Her main areas of research are poverty, ethnicity, migration, education, racism, political extremism, and media and minorities. And her recent work focuses on child trafficking and mainstreaming extreme right discourses, limits of tolerance, as well as Islamophobia in Hungary. So we go with our first question to Monica. Monica, please, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in Poland?
Yes, obviously, whatever. So, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this interesting seminar. I'm really happy to have opportunity to participate in the discussion and to have a platform to compare our observation regarding race and racism in different countries. And yes, I'm going to focus on the Polish context. Your first question basically refers to the historical context, historical roots of racism as it is observed in Polish society now. And when I was thinking about what particular elements could be important for understanding the specificity of the Polish context. I decided that perhaps three historical elements are particularly important if we want to understand the sociological and historical dynamics of racism in Poland. I'm not sure if all of them you will find like immediately obvious, but there are three elements I wanted to focus on. One is a special position of Poland in regard to the very concept of Europe and in this global relations between the West and the East. Because whenever you think about racism and race, the main reference point is this hierarchy of racialized intergroup relations that has developed in the course of European modernity, in connection with European colonialism, in connection of the establishment of slavery in American context. This kind of historical developments are crucial, but whenever you mind for the discourses on race, for the development of racist institutions in the Western context. But whenever you talk about this kind of things, you have to ask the question, what is the relationship of this history and Polish historical experience? So one thing which is important is the fact that we are somewhere in between. We are the society that has never had overseas colonies, that had no slavery, so somehow is located on the margins, on the peripheries of this kind of European or Western history. So I'm emphasizing this position in between because on the one hand, you could see that the forms of racism that have developed in Polish societies are somehow indirect, are somehow mediated by this position in relation to the Western European countries. And also this peripheral position was the reason for which Polish people became target of racializing discourses in the past. So you've got this kind of experience that on the one hand, we had all those kinds of discourses, racist discourses, taken from Western contexts and adopted in Polish context. At the same time, you have this history of being, I mean, Polish society, Polish people have the history of being racialized. I mean, if you look at the 19th century and discourses in Prussia that were developed in regard to the Eastern European peoples, Slav people, Poles in particular, you will see this ideas of inferiority of all those Eastern peoples. So it is still an experience, it is coded in culture, it is somehow defining this position in Europe. Obviously, I suppose many of us know the book by Larry Wolff, Inventing Eastern Europe, which is also describing this kind of process of constructing Eastern European otherness in this European context. So this is one element. And I think it is still important in all those processes that result in the development of specifically Eastern European forms of racism. Another thing, another historical experience I want to draw your attention to is something related to the historical social structure in Poland related to the nobility-peasant relations. At first, it may seem not relevant for any discussion about racism, contemporary discussion about racism, but if you look at Polish history, you see that due to different historical processes, this Eastern European economic and social development was different than in the West. And until mid-19th century, we basically had the system of serfdom in our region, which in literature devoted to this topic is very often compared to the system of black slavery in the United States. Obviously, there are significant differences, but also many people compare it to the system of slavery and draw our attention to the fact that in this particular relation, you had a lot of relations that could be described with reference to the concept of racialization. You know? And I'm talking about this because obviously in the course of the 20th century, this relation was transformed into particular class relations in Polish context, but it is relevant this history of peasants who still in the 19th century constituted 80% of the population. This history is obscured. I mean, if you take this element seriously, you would have to think about Poland as a not only post-peasant society, but post-slavery society, with all the consequences, sociological and cultural consequences of this fact. I'm talking about it also because this particular dynamics was very important for the development of another form of racism that is absolutely crucial. I mean, you have to take it into account if you want to understand the realities of Polish history, which is anti-Semitism. Obviously, anti-Semitism has got a long and complex history and roots, religious, theological, sociological, etc. But in Polish context, I think it has a special significance due to, first of all, a large Jewish community that lived in Poland, and also the fact that the discourse of anti-Semitism in early 20th century was crucial for constituting the concept of an ethnic Polish nation. So anti-Semitism was something that basically defined, was like an ideological instrument used to construct in 20th century of the concept of the ethnic Polish nation. So it is very strongly intertwined with all kinds of nationalist discourses. And this, you know, you have this society deeply divided along this class lines related to this past history of peasant nobility relations that were racialized. And early 20th century, it was the attempt to construct unified nations out of this divided population. And anti-Semitism had this special function of constructing of this particular national unity. For this reason, all those elements, I think, are important pieces of this puzzle, which create this special Polish combination of racist resentments and mechanisms, and also they fuel the strength of racist ideologies in Polish history. So those three elements: semi-peripheral or semi-peripheral position of Poland between the West and the East, which is also experienced. I mean, this special position is not only, I hear some noises.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Monica, because I guess we have the picture, and it is extremely interesting the way you broaden the frame in which we put our debate with the nobility peasant relation, and also it is extremely interesting for us how you positionate Poland. Because the idea in this webinar series is exactly to make possible a debate between old colonial powers country, modern colonial powers country, peripheral or failed colonial powers country, and historical dominated country. So you really mentioned, you really fit into our frame. Thanks for these three elements. And I would now pass the floor to Zuza, posing the same question. So Zuza, please, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and races in Hungary?
Thank you. Thank you very much for for the invitation. I'm very glad to participate in this series on racism and talk about the Hungarian case and to give some some picture of Hungary. First of all, I'd like to briefly talk about three types of racism. Very briefly, obviously, anti-Gypsyism, anti-Semitism, and the most recent form of racism, that is anti-Muslimism or Islamophobia, that actually is a very recent phenomenon. And I will talk a little bit more about anti-Gypsyism as a form of racism, and a little bit less about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and probably come back later in the second and third question. So I would like to start with the fact that was also emphasized by Monica, that Hungary is not a colonial country, not a colonial nation. So it has a different historical past than that of Western countries with colonial history. So therefore, race and racism has to be conceptualized differently. And it's important that the birth of the modern nation state was a history of assimilation. So it's the assimilation of the multi-ethnic or rather multinational population of the Hungarian kingdom. The Hungarian kingdom that at the time belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So at the same, so there are two things. So at the same time, it was we can call it an internal colonizer. But on the other hand, it was also suppressed, or a non-independent nation, as being part of the empire. So, and looking back on history, the country had been under foreign occupations, fully or partially, in various historical periods. So this actually created an identity that is both constructed as representing cultural superiority. It's kind of a colonizer identity, so to say. But at the same time, it also has a victim identity because of the successive occupations and oppressions by foreign powers. So this feeling of superiority and inferiority at the same time is what we can find as the core of racism, and the question is how. And I would like to demonstrate this through a very concise history of anti-Gypsyism in Hungary. So concerning the Roma in Hungary and in other Central Eastern European countries as well, although we know that they have very different histories depending on the country context. So basically they came under the same assimilationist intentions as all other nationalities in the 19th century. So they were assimilated, and that is reflected in the fact that the majority of Roma actually lost their language, to some extent their culture as well. So it's a minority of the minority that still has its own language and more cultural traits. So in a way, if we look at it from the assimilating nation states points of view, it's a success story. They lost their original culture and language, and it was a culturally very distinct population. So so what happens? What happened later and how it relates to racism? So because we know that Roma is the most disadvantaged, the most racialized, the most discriminated group. And not to forget about their fate during the Second World War. And even today, they are the most rejected ethnic group by the majority. That concerns their labor market situation, the limits of access to education due to racial discrimination and segregation, and many other issues. Well, in a way, I mean, we can analyze it from various perspectives, but we can also look at it from a structural point of view. So if you take it as a structural issue, so that Roma for a period of time had their place in the Hungarian society. Again, talking about the 19th century, that's the time of assimilation. There were open niches in the economy where they could fit in, and that allowed them to assimilate culturally as well. Then with the industrial modernization, there was no need anymore for many of the professions and occupation they had been involved in. They lost the grounds of their economic integration, and they became a pariah group. Again, we can say, discriminated and persecuted during the war. And under state socialism, their economic integration was to some extent supported by the state, though at the expense of their cultural identities. So we see that there are different periods of economic, social integration, which actually goes along with their cultural integration as well. With the regime change in 1890, the political change took place along with economic transition from state-controlled economy to market economy. And this change put the Roma population once again in history in an economically disadvantaged and precarious position. Most of them lost their employment, economic stability, and some literature talks about them as the new underclass. So during state socialism, and this is how we come back to racism, racism towards the Roma was state-censored, basically. No open racism against the Roma was allowed. It was actually penalized. But of course, in everyday interactions, there were incidents of racism. But what happened after 1889 that concerns the Roma, but that concerns also racism in general, the discourse radically changed, and racism that had been so far suppressed or controlled by the state became open racism. And that took various forms, ranging from discursive racism towards to hate crimes of various kinds as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you. It was really nice the way you traced this historical perspective on the anti-Gypsy situation. And if I can compare with the Italian situation, although it is always a compromise because you lose something every time you integrate. It's much more better in Hungary than what it seems to be in Italy, where they have their own culture but completely excluded, living in an almost apartheid situation that is extremely bad, of course. So now we could go back to Monica with a question that brings us to the actual situation. So what are the terms of the theoretical and public debates on race and racism? And I think we are going to talk about migrants, maybe. Thank you, Monica. The floor is yours.
Now, what about now? Yeah, okay, great. So first of all, when you think about debates, theoretical and public debates on race and racism, you see that they always depend on the political circumstances. The timing of particular discussions are related with politics, and again, obviously, one special case is anti-Semitism and how it was silenced. I mean, not debated, really removed from the public interest. That was, during the socialist time, anti-Semitism was not really discussed. We had some moments of where it really came back to the surface and became, 1968 in Poland. It is an outburst of anti-Semitism. But basically, talking about the history of Polish anti-Semitism started after 1989, slowly a little bit, but most important discussions related to that started after the publication of Tomasz Gross's book entitled Neighbors, which basically presented the complicity of Polish society in the Holocaust. And it became a very difficult topic. At some point, it inspired some open research and discussion about Polish anti-Semitism. So it was just, last 2 decades, but soon after it started, it was confronted with backlash. I mean, with all those institutionalized attempts to silence the discussion, to deny this kind of elements of Polish history. And now it is basically an ongoing process. I mean, you've got now in Poland cases of silencing the researchers who are trying to explore the history of Polish anti-Semitism and especially participation of Polish people in the Holocaust. So just now we've got this court case where Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski were charged for insulting a Polish nation and giving inappropriate account of what happened. So basically researchers now risk being taken to the court if they deal with this kind of problematic issues, especially in reference to anti-Semitism. So this is one line of problems. What happens when researchers start to talk about anti-Semitism and how it is translated into the public discourse. So it is a very delicate and politicized issue at the moment. So that's one complex of problems. Another one, which was particularly interesting for me a few years ago when I was doing my research on Islamophobia in Europe and in Poland. And something interesting was going on around that because for some time, any comparisons between anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim attitudes and discourses was contested. But in 2015, during the refugee crisis, the situation radically changed. And also those academic and discussions outside academia regarding this anti-refugee, anti-Muslim sentiments, I mean, it was more accepted and people started to see the similarities between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism became a kind of a model for understanding what is basically happening, what was basically happening in regard to Muslims. So this kind of discussions appeared at some point, and so I think it is interesting to draw your attention to that. But there is something else. I mean, you can see that, especially in recent years in Poland, there are surprising continuities between different forms of prejudice and different forms of violent campaigns against minorities in Poland. And this kind of continuity that I want to talk about is the fact that you could see similarities and links between anti-Muslim, anti-refugee discourses from especially that started in this politicized form in 2015, this continuity with a current anti-LGBT campaign in Poland. You see that the same first of all, the same political actors are pronouncing this kind of discourses. You see very similar patterns. You see this very similar ways of attacking these minorities. You see that you've got this common idea that both like Muslims, refugees, and LGBT people are supported from outside. They are somehow linked with political forces from outside Polish nation, which are basically meant to destroy Polish sovereignty, culture, and political. You know, you've got also very interesting similarity between current anti-LGBT campaign and typical anti-Semitic campaigns, which focuses on the threat that LGBT people constitute for children. It was also in this anti-Semitic outburst in Poland, you know, like pogroms, started with this accusation of Jews that they are capturing and killing children for blood. You know, it's like an element of this anti-Semitic tradition. So now we see the striking similarities in this anti-LGBT campaign, which is focusing on how dangerous the presence of LGBT people is for Polish children. Yeah? So you can draw this kind of parallels, which basically show whenever we discuss racism, we have to connect it with different forms of, with analysis of different forms of prejudice and hate campaigns that are developed. They are using the same or similar models. You know? Last thing I wanted to say is that again, we've got these discussions about race and racism. And what is important is the fact that all kinds of, many attempts to deny the existence of racism, to deny, for example, in connection with the events from the United States after the death of George Floyd from last May and June, you know, these discussions about racism and race are, I mean, what positions are taken, what arguments are used, those kind of things are related to anti-communist ideologies developed in Poland. What I mean by that is that any support for minorities, any criticism of systemic character of racism very often is described as this leftist, communist political correctness, which is not sociologically adequate, but it is a form of ideology. Yeah? So you see that in those debates, how people situate themselves in relation to the problem of racism is very often linked to their identification with anti-communism, which is a dominating ideology at the moment. Yeah? So this element is crucial, especially, I mean, good example here is Janusz Waluś. I wonder if you remember this person. He assassinated Chris Hani in South Africa in 1991. Chris Hani was an activist, communist activist who struggled against apartheid. Janusz Waluś was a Polish immigrant in South Africa, and so he killed Chris Hani and was put into prison, and he claimed that he did it because of his anti-communism. Obviously, his discourse is racist. He was supported by pro-apartheid forces. But in Poland now, in right-wing circles, for example, also you can see that in football fan circles, Janusz Waluś is a hero. And he's a hero because he was anti-communist, but anti-communism in this case is a kind of mask for pro-apartheid thinking, for this kind of anti-black racism. So you've got this, and you've got like people petitioning for releasing Janusz Walus from prison or for bringing him to Poland. Yeah, so you see his images on the football stadiums. Many right-wing leaders are talking about him. So I'm referring to this example because it illustrates how those explicitly racist discourses and forms of politics are related with this identification with anti-communism, yeah, this way of use. So also, I mean, if you ask about theoretical and public debates on race and racism, yes, the very the perception of what was happening in relation with Black Lives Matter is crucial here, because the debate really started at this point in reaction to these events. Again, you could observe very polarized reactions, and many things, I mean, happened in the discourse. Perhaps I will talk about it more because you've got a separate question regarding Black Lives Matter, but I only mention one thing. That something new has been happening recently, in recent years, and this new thing is growing participation in a public discourse, participation of Polish Black community. They started to organize, they created organization. A number of people from those Black Polish community or Afro-Polish community.
Sorry. Monica, sorry, I would pass through Susa, otherwise we run too long and we run out of time. If you don't mind,
okay.
then
I do understand. I will continue when we come.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining us how the discourses are mixing, addressing different targets and enlarging targets, and it is interesting to see how the same discourse can be applied to other type of minorities. But yes, we have to keep it shorter, otherwise we are not able to fix it in 1 hour. So Susa, please. Now, the question is for you, what are the terms of the theoretical and public debates on race and racism in Hungary?
Yes, okay. So I'll talk about the terms of the debate on race and racism in the context of the current democratic backsliding. So as part of the polarizing strategy used by the government in the 2015 anti-refugee and anti-immigrant campaign, so there was a campaign launched for political purposes, and since then the immigrant issue has been the center political topic of the government, and it's used time and time again to mobilize government voters. And actually the success of this strategy in terms of keeping the current party coalition in power has led to a stark polarization of the Hungarian population, since the main narrative asserts that those who are not supporters of the government are the enemies of the nation and even agents of foreign forces. I mean, obviously this is not a new narrative, but it's a very strong narrative at the moment. Within this context, the government generated polarization, and civil society actors also became an enemy, especially those who work to mitigate racism and extremism and want to reinforce democratic values, human rights, critical thinking, dialogue, and partnership. So they became also an enemy. As in many other similar regimes. These words represent values that are missing from the vocabulary of the governments. And more than that, anyone using them is suspicious and labeled as a liberal, a left-winger, a communist, a foreign agent, or some other derogatory terms. So the government has in recent years successfully constructed a narrative in which it is the only force that can defend the Hungarian nation, and not only the Hungarian nation, but Europe as well, against Islamic migration, irresponsible and the irresponsible European leaders and the Soros civil society network, whose aim is to settle migrants in Europe. So there is this constant attack, and the government can defend the Hungarians. Hungary has been vigilant and kept safe, according to the government, unlike the deteriorating West, which has been plagued by social conflicts and terrorism rising from the ideology of multiculturalism. So this fearmonger by the intentional democratic actions, revising the electoral system in a way that blatantly favors the government coalition, restricting freedom of press, persecuting non-government and public actors. And the government aims to exert control in the public sphere by curtailing autonomy and centralized authority over various public institutions. And from another perspective, the government uses not only a polarizing but an extremist narrative. The anti-immigrant rhetoric that the government uses is similar to what the far right uses in Western European countries. It's the same core. It has the same core elements. It is a government it's a government or mainstream generated extremism, what we can talk about in today's Hungary. As many governments who take the immigrant issue to their core agenda, the Hungarian government also frames the topic in the securitization narrative. According to this narrative, immigration and immigrants or refugees constitute a constant security threat to the citizens and the nation. Therefore, all kinds of measures and policies are acceptable. It is also part of a wider political strategy. Before the Fidesz, the governing party, came into power, the extreme right Jobbik party had been on the rise. Political and public racism dominated public speech. Far-right extremist groups held demonstrations, hate marches without the police effectively intervening. Since 2010, since this coalition has been in power, the far-right political position has weakened, and primarily because the governing party took over important issues the far-right usually nurtures. The rise of the new far-right party, the Jobbik, was dominantly due to its anti-Roma rhetoric, because the population holds very strong racist attitudes, so it helped their quick and effective political ascendance. So for Fidesz, it was essential that Jobbik, the far-right party, is pushed to the background, as it was a party with great potentials. And by using polarizing and extremist rhetoric, it was easy to weaken the far-right scene. So another political gain from pushing the far-right to the margins and taking over their rhetoric is that the government can claim that it managed to take control on extremists, including the far-right political party and the extremist, sometimes militant far-right organizations. Nevertheless, the far-right never used the immigrant issue before in Hungary due to the anti-immigrant political climate created by the government. It started to engage more in the issue and became more integrated into international far-right networks. While the anti-immigrant narrative has been one of Fidesz's main political tools, the more traditional racisms, such as anti-Roma and anti-Jewish, have been, to some extent, avoided by the government, but I will talk a little bit more about that. In other words, by creating the newest enemy, the migrant, it was possible to shift the attention away from the old ones. So while the government condemns anti-Semitism, it declared zero tolerance and has good relationship with certain Jewish organizations and promotes issues related to the teaching and remembrance of the Holocaust. It has a double narrative. It's always claimed by the government and is used as the main argument demonstrating its non-anti-Semitism is that there are hardly any racial attacks committed in the country. But at the same time, surveys on prejudices based on questions like, do you think Jewish people have too much influence in the media or in the financial world, shows that roughly 1/3 of Hungarians holds some form of anti-Semitic views. Also, the government plays a symbolic politics that is drawing on the traditions of anti-Semitic period of the 1930s, electing statues, memorials, celebrating that period, and so on. The government also launches one of its most extended and successful hateful campaigns against the Hungarian origin billionaire George Soros, who is a well-known Jewish philanthrope, by using coded or even uncoded anti-Semitic symbols. He was associated with the migrant issue by claiming that he and the civil organizations supported by him or by foreign funds have the plot to settle migrants in the country. In consequence, that part of the population that is open and receptive of anti-Semitic messages has its constant input from the government. So, and also the state recognition of people who openly embrace anti-Semitic ideas is also weakening the credibility of the Hungarian government's claim to zero toleration. And also next to migrant racist narrative and anti-Semitism, the anti-LGBTQ narrative is used by the government as the same as in Poland. Then the main issue is to emphasize the importance of the traditional family and family values. And just as a last word, the counter narratives, there's always been anti-racist narratives, but now those who present or generate those narratives are the enemies, and they are labeled in a very traditional line of division, either left or right divide, or liberal versus conservative, cosmopolitan versus national, Jewish, Muslim versus Christian. Yes, that's it from me on this question so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's extremely interesting to hear how in different contexts the situation is getting worse and worse. And I think that these kind of debate we are promoting are extremely important in order to learn from each other how to resist in a certain form, because we are there, we are at the resistance now, given the censorship and this idea of enemy that in the western part of Europe it's like more its frame has the criminalization of those supporting migrants and the anti-racism. As the time is running late, I would kindly ask to stay in 4 minutes with your answer, and I'm going to put the last question so that we can have just a few minutes for questions from the audience. So the question now is on the Black Lives Matter. To what extent and in which ways has the Black Lives Matter influenced the anti-racist movement in your country? Monica, you start, and then Susan again. Thank you.
Okay, so in Poland we had a number of protests in more than 12 cities. It was last May, end of May and June. So people mobilized to protest. Some actions, some protests were also organized in front of American embassy in Warsaw. And so those slogans supporting the movement of Black Lives Matter was appearing in Poland. And a number of topics appeared in the public debates in connection with those events in the US. One thing is that I already tried to mention in my previous answer is this mobilization of Black Polish people who started to be vocal and who started to be visible in this particular context, yeah, and that's I really consider it very important, because before, all those discussions regarding anti-Black racism in Poland were usually conducted above the heads of this tiny minority in Poland. And now we've got representatives who are vocal, who are active in culture. We've got theater directors, we've got academics, you know, who start to problematize this kind of issues and voice the perspective of the minority in Poland. And in connection with those events from the last year, we had a very interesting action, Stop Calling Me Murzyn, which was a campaign against the common use of the words Murzyn, which is an equivalent of Negro, and which is considered as offensive And at the same time, in mainstream Polish discourses, it is commonly used, and many people were trying to argue that they are not going to change the language because it is a term from dictionary. And the highly politicized heated debate started around linguistic issues that were let's see, pretty important in this process of learning what racism is and how to change this kind of issues. So you had, on the one hand, in connection with Black Lives Matter, we had this protest, we had those debates in public, in press, we had this action that was related to the language, but also a number of actions related to postulating the revision of the cultural canon, Polish cultural canon, which basically means thinking about literary works which are highly respected, still taught at school, and at the same time they are full of racist prejudices. And that's particularly the case, emblematic case is a Polish Nobel Prize writer from the turn of 19th and 20th century, Henryk Sienkiewicz, and his book in which he described Africans in a very racist way. So I'm mentioning this fact because, again, it was a heated debate, and the idea that we should rethink our culture canon was met with a very strong opposition. So this kind of discussion started, and I consider them pretty important in this process of revising Polish culture and really thinking about the perspective of the minorities, which was pretty absent in the Polish context. So this kind of things happened in relation with Black Lives Movement. Obviously, at the same time, Black Lives Matter, at the same time, you could observe development of all kinds of very racist narratives, countering, I mean, denying the legitimacy of the movement and emphasizing, this fact of vandalism and illegal actions and this kind of thing. So yes, you could observe different forms of reactions to these events. But also something starting, some kind of voices appearing in Polish debates, and I consider it especially valuable, even though in general probably the picture is pessimistic. I mean, in the sense that a lot of racism also was articulated in connection with those events.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Monica. Okay, now, Susa, the floor is yours. To what extent and in which ways has the Black Lives Matter influenced the anti-racism movement in Hungary?
Thank you. Let me outline some of the typical discourses used in the polarized political and public sphere on the BLM movement. I'd like to give some examples from public discourse and media discourse supporting the government. So what were the tropes and issues that they used and that were important when talking about BLM? So they emphasized, first of all, the violence of this whole movement and the demonstrations, the radicalism and extremism of the movement, and the presence of Antifa and the lootings and everything similar to that. And also another very important topic was children. So how kids are targeted in school. So they brought examples from the United States, from various advertisements and posters and so on. So how dangerous anti-racism is. That's what I wanted to demonstrate through these examples. That kids are targeted in schools, calling them racist, and how they are taught from the very beginning that they have this white privilege, and so basically making them feel bad, making them feel guilty. So that was again a very important line of discussion or discourse. And so basically they depicted the movement as scary, fearful. Anti-racism is a fearful thing. And then I would bring in as a last thing and a very interesting example of countering this dominant narrative. And this is the case of a temporary statue that is planned to be erected in the spring this year. It's one of the districts of Budapest where there is an opposition mayor. And the statue is actually the American Statue of Freedom, kneeling in rainbow colors. That would be a temporary statue. And of course, there's debate around this statue. And one of the government's chief of staff or the chief of staff told to a newspaper that, and this is a quote, "Black Lives Matter is basically a racist movement. The racist is not the person who opposes BLM statue, but the person who erects one." So I think this is the maybe I talk more about the government's discourse than the counter discourse, but this is how it's now framed in the public debates.
Thank you very much, you both, and I guess we should keep on talking about this different what's happening in different contexts around Europe. There's one question to both of you coming from the chat, and the question is there any way global context of race and racism can help us to understand racism in Poland and Hungary? Is not clear the question?
No, I couldn't hear you for some moment.
Okay, I repeat it. So it's for both of you. And the question is there any way the global context of race and racism can help us to understand racism in Poland and Hungary? I guess the question is, it would like to talk about how from outside Poland and Hungary we can better understand what's happening there in terms of possible, maybe also possible reading or indication to further explore the context in Hungary and in Poland.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I mean, you know, recent developments really confirm the fact that we are linked to the global context. Yes, we've got our specificity, it's our history, which is basically responsible for the particular forms racism takes, but still the context is global, and so it's not separate. And obviously, it is also related to migration, not only in the sense of migrants coming to Poland, but also of migrants, Polish migrants going to other countries. Yeah? So this kind of global connections are pretty clear when you think about experiences of Polish migrants. And this is all, again, a very interesting topic which basically you can analyze in connection with early 20th century migration of Polish people to the States, or current migration of Polish people to the Western European countries, where you could see again that on the one hand, Eastern Europeans and Polish people experience some forms of xenophobia and also racism, and at the same time they use racism as a form of integration in those receiving societies. Yes, so again, it is all immersed in this global system of racialized relations. Yeah, so we experience this kind of things, and obviously you've got a lot of paradoxes related to that. Yeah? Meaning that you've got people adopting racist discourses against non-Europeans, and at the same time not being happy with being a target of racism on the part of receiving societies. Yeah? So you've got these paradoxes of nationalist people who are immigrants in Western countries, yeah, who are, you see, living as immigrants outside their own country, and at the same time adopting anti-immigrant discourses. Yeah, you've got this kind of paradoxes in relation to the experiences. And again, this is a product of those global relations and the place we take in this kind of context. So yes, I mean, this is not separate from global context. Definitely, we've got our specificity, but all those phenomena are linked. You know?
Thank you, Monica. Thank you a lot. And Susan?
Okay, I would just raise one issue that is, we see more and more internationalization of racism. We see, like, and anti-racism as well, but we see more and more polarization in probably, well, lots of countries, and we can name some countries in specific, but I think this is a really important issue to understand why polarization is happening. So we put more into anti-racism, but we have more racism. So it's like it's really like we are at war, and it's always been like that. But we see more and more of it. And for me, like, one important question is to understand the root causes, obviously. But for example, just to take the case of Hungary, in recent years, we've seen economic growth. We've seen that the majority of population experience more economic stability than before, or for many years, and still we have more racism. So it's like we need to explain. Of course, we cannot explain. It shows that we cannot explain racism with economic instability, but we cannot. So it's obviously needs more kinds of explanations, but I think it's very important to understand, like, the context. So why? So it's because, yeah, it's growing, but why is it growing? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much to both Monica Bobako and Susa Vidra for this overview on the Eastern countries context. And yes, we are really facing hard times. This is clear, and so we have to keep in touch and to try to address this resistance in the best way we can. Now we can start, and I thank you very much for participating, and I hope to have the chance to see you soon in the future. So now we can start the second section of today. And we are going to have a debate between experts from Sweden and Switzerland. From Sweden, we have Anders Nergård, who is a professor in sociology, especially international migration and ethnic relations at Linköping University. His research and publication are on labor migration, racialized discrimination, trade union organization, and extreme right-wing racist parties, applying intersectional perspective of class, racialization, and gender. And Anders is also the director of REMESO, Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity, and Society. And from Switzerland, we have two speakers, Yvonne Riano, an associate professor at the Geography Institute of the University of Neuchâtel. And she's also the chair, the Swiss National Committee of International Geographic Union. Yvonne obtained her PhD in human geography from the University of Ottawa. Then she moved to Austrian University, and now she is in Switzerland. She is really an international woman, and we are grateful to have her here today. And she specialized on geography of inequality. With her, we have the pleasure to listen also to Dr. Stéphanie Boulila, who describes herself as a feminist researcher with a background in gender studies and sociology, developing a transdisciplinary work engaged with race in Europe, gender equality, and LGBT lives, especially lesbians' lives, and inequalities in Swiss Alpine region. So let me immediately start posing the question. I would start with Ander, who is the only male we have today. So we are a little bit gender unbalanced. So Ander, please, we are seeing your screen, Yvonne. So, okay, Yvonne and Stephanie were so kind to prepare some slides for us where the questions are already there. So, Anders, please, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in Sweden?
First I wanted to say thank you for the two previous presentations, because it's interesting to situate each country in the history and then relate it. And in the Swedish case, I mean, Sweden was a poor feudal country until the late 19th century. So, as we spoke on Poland, I mean, 20% of the Swedish population left, mainly for United States, but for other countries also, up to the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time, we saw a rapid industrialization also. So when we talk about how to capture race and racialization in Sweden, I think there are a number of different approaches. One is to talk about nearby or internal colonialism. And of course, that includes the colonization of the indigenous population, Sami population, in today's northern Sweden, but that they see as Sapmi territory. But it also includes in other so-called national minorities, the Swedish legislation based on the European Union directive. And we've already talked about two in relation to Hungary and Poland, Jews and the Roma, but it also are a group of Meänkieli. It's a group of with Finnish background in the northern part of Sweden, and the Swedish Finns. They are quite small groups, although the Roma population is around 50 to 100,000, with the exception of the Swedish Finns, that is calculated to be around 500,000. So that's one group, and that's also what we saw as earlier forms of racialization and racism, although they survive and still are present in the Swedish society. Not either to forget that in 1922, Sweden set up the State Institute of Racial Biology, competing with Germany and United States in biological racism through research institutions. Could be a reminder for us as academics. And they were especially focusing on the Sami, but also the Finnish, and they were capable of really racializing the Finns, a neighboring, and the Sami population to an extent that it lived on for a long time. But another aspect, and that comes with the 1930s, and that is what I would call the age of the social democracy and what I would call inclusionary subordination. And that is partially linked to labor migration and refugee migration. And why I call it subordinated inclusion was that during this period, there was a clear racialization of labor migrants, not the least from Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe and Turkey, and later on refugees from all of the world, but also we had two groups of refugees that we've already talked about, namely the Hungarians leaving in '56 to Sweden, and Polish refugees coming in at least two different waves from Poland to Sweden. So these groups were in one way racialized, but in a project of inclusion or reducing inequalities of the social democratic era, the racialization didn't have the stark consequences that we see to a certain extent today. One thing that we didn't talk about in relation to Hungary and Poland, and that is to also see Sweden as a failed colonial power. Sweden tried to build up colonies in Western Africa and in the Caribbean, but they failed and they were short-lived. However, Sweden was quite good as a trading power and was participating through iron production and shipping in the transatlantic slavery. And this, in a sense, continued into the rapid industrialization. And I think it's also important to understand that racist processes are also linked in a global, and that goes to the question we had in the previous session. And I'm talking about how workers in the global south are constructed, often employed by transnational Swedish enterprises or the commodity chain subcontracting of workers in the global south that are seen as cheap labor and that are often racialized as not necessitating more wages than they receive. But the big issue in Sweden is linked to migrants and foreign-born. It's about 2 million of the 10 million population in Sweden that are foreign-born, both composed of labor migrants, but lately and more so of refugees and family reunification migrants. And of those, we see a strong discourse today of anti-Muslim racism, but also of anti-Black from parts of Africa and anti-Arabic racism. So we see both historical continuities and transformation, and we see a number of overlapping diverse forms of racism when we talk about Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. It was nice the way you put the attention on the racialization process happening internally on minorities. And well, it is nice to hear that Sweden has a colonial past or a failed one, because now this could be taken as an advantage, I see, in this post-colonial and decolonization time. And now the question is for Yvonne. Please, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in Switzerland?
Thanks, Gia. Well, in Switzerland, in the 1990s, James Baldwin, the famous Afro-American novelist, visited the Swiss alpine village of Leukerbad. He later wrote the book Stranger in the Village, which recounts the experience of being Black in an all-white village. Baldwin depicts naked and obvious racism in this white wilderness, as he called it. The children in the alleyways call him nigger, and the villagers treat him as an exotic curiosity and hold him responsible of robbing wood. In his book, based on this experience, Baldwin reflects how the idea of white supremacy rests simply on the fact that white men are the creators of civilization, and I think he really means white men, and therefore civilization's guardians and defenders. The identity depends on the systematic exclusion of non-whites and therefore on the watchful policing of the borders of civilization. For Puchert and Fischer-Tiné, Leukerbad's population seemed to incorporate an ideal type of European colonial worldview. They behaved as if Black people were unknown strangers. At the same time, they seemed to fully incorporated the sense of white supremacy that works as a collectively shared value in colonial Europe. Baldwin's essay constitutes a very interesting and compelling description of Swiss racism and colonial culture in the 1950s. This idea of colonial naivete, colonial innocence, makes reference to Switzerland asserting not to be part of the colonial project while making use of white supremacy ideology. Although Switzerland has not held any colonies, various post-colonial scholars have argued that entanglements with European colonialism have been significant for Swiss history. As we know today, Swiss companies and families profited from colonialism and the slave trade. The Neuchâtel merchant Jacques Portal, for example, was one of the richest Swiss at the end of the 18th century. He made his fortune from slave plantations in Latin America. In the 18th century as well, Basel merchant Christoph Burckhardt participated and benefited from 21 slave trade expeditions. Moreover, Swiss science contributed to anthropometric racial science, which we know on the concept of biologically distinct races. The problematic entanglements of Swiss development aid have also been identified as part of a broader European colonial project. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I like the way you present this historical perspective through individual stories that talks a lot. Yeah, thank you. And also for the images. You gave the point of view of the other being in a racializing society, and you also addressed the white supremacy concept that is one of the focus which put our attention. So thank for this. Let's go to the second question to Anders. So Anders, please, what are the terms of the theoretical and public debates on race and racism in Sweden now?
Yeah, I started already in my previous section with 1922. And I think it's important to understand that not only biological, but also anthropology and sociology was born as racist disciplines in a sense. And this has, to a certain extent, changed, but to a certain extent survived, although being more and more challenged by different perspectives. So if we see the Swedish history on the theoretical debate, I would argue that especially scholars with racialized backgrounds have been central in developing the theories and empirical studies on racism and discrimination. And it goes back already to the 50s and 60s with a Jewish scholar, Schwartz, that started this. And then we've seen different generations of migrants, in some ways reflecting also the migration patterns, with Nordic migrants, Finnish, Danish scholars, with Yugoslavian scholars, Greek scholars reflecting the labor migration, later on by Latin American, Iranian scholars reflecting that migration. And they have been very central in driving a more critical perspective. So while the old, more or less racist ideas still, to a certain extent, either actively or more passively can be found in the academia, today we have a much broader language and theoretical perspectives where post-colonial theory, critical race theory, whiteness studies, radical perspectives of ethnicity and so on are still there. But it's still fantastic as being, quote unquote, a second generation migrant, that so large part of European academy still uses a concept where a person like me, born in Sweden from migrants' parents, are still called a migrant, a second generation migrant, although I've never migrated myself. And this is a way that a lot of the process of racialization is continued and reproduced by ascribing migration not as a process of moving from a country, but as a characteristics of human being, as being forever migrants. So, and that goes for the Jews, that goes for the Roma, but especially in Sweden today, it goes for Afro-Swedes and for those with Muslim country backgrounds in Sweden. So that in the public debate, we've seen a very strong growth of ethno-nationalism. I would argue that 5 of the 8, including the 3 biggest parliamentary parties, are today maneuvering, linking migrants with threats of all kinds to Sweden. So we are in a period, I would say the last 10, 15 years has been a period of a reassertion of ethno-nationalism and direct racism and different forms of cultural racism, especially interpolated through an anti-Muslim racism, but much wider in discourse. Thanks.
Thank you, Anders, for being so clear and so precise and then putting on the table so many issues. Yes, we are looking for those racialized researchers, because from their side we can have the real insights of what racism is. As white, it's the white privilege impedes us to a certain extent to fully understand what it means to be racialized. And now I'm happy to give the floor to Stephanie, asking her what are the terms of the theoretical and public debates on race and racism in Switzerland. Please, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me as well. Now, I'm answering this question through the lens of race critical theory, which is the basis for my work. And my argument is going to be very condensed, but it is written up in my book, Race in Post-Racial Europe, as well as in an article on race in Switzerland. So I have to apologize because it is very much reduced. But overall, it is fair to say that in Switzerland, both the theoretical and the public debate is governed by anti-racialism. So as an approach, anti-racialism is obviously not exclusive to Switzerland, but it refuses a critical examination of the political conditions that enable racialization and racism. Now, I'm drawing on the work of Alana Lentin and David Theo Goldberg, and obviously Alana Lentin has argued in her study on anti-racism in Europe that anti-racialism is actually the dominant approach to anti-racism in Europe. And what it does, it goes back to the UNESCO statements on race that were formulated in the 1950s and 60s, and that were an attempt to get rid of the idea of race. The problem with this approach is that it very much frames race as a pseudo-scientific concept and narrowly and, well, actually exclusively ties it to scientific racism, which is a very narrow and very problematic conceptualization of race. So with that, it fails to acknowledge race as a performative discursive system with material effects, and it allows the denial of systemic racism. Now, anti-racialism is very central to public discourse in Switzerland, and an example of this is Swiss state anti-racism. So, for example, the governing body that is charged by the government to oversee the implementation of ICERD, which is the international treaty against racism that Switzerland has ratified, they very much frame race as a pseudoscientific concept and from this logic, they kind of frame racism as an interpersonal problem between people and as an aberration from the norm. So instead of conceptualizing race as something that is written into our state, that is written into society, into knowledge, into practices, it is kind of set aside as something that is exceptional. And that is very problematic. Now, another issue in Switzerland is the direct democratic system. So it can be argued that the direct democratic system, well, in a state where people who don't have citizenship are excluded from the direct democratic system, it has a negative effect on the self-organization of racialized people. So the debate on anti-racism has very much been dominated by white left actors. And many anti-racist organizations are working towards a decision at the ballot, so a referendum or a popular initiative. And what I have seen in the literature is that there was very much the idea that there is a fear of alienating the white Swiss electorate, and that has led to a very problematic whitening of anti-racism and a very problematic and unexamined politics of respectability. And this has very much undermined the self-organization of racialized groups. Now, in recent years, Switzerland's direct democratic processes and initiatives have raised international concern. You can see some of the posters there. There have been a series of successful referendums and popular initiatives by the far right, accompanied by racist campaigns and public debates. And the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, so they oversee the implementation of ICERD internationally. They have repeatedly expressed deep concern over racism in political discourse, particularly surrounding those initiatives. So in 2009, and that's posted in the middle, we had the minaret ban. Then we had the initiative against mass migration in February 2014, which was an initiative that demanded a limitation of immigration from the EU by means of quota. And now next month, we are voting on a burqa ban, which will also ban the niqab, although in Switzerland, and this shouldn't even be an argument, but just so you know, you don't see women wearing the niqab in Switzerland. So this initiative is very much there to kind of create a racist discourse and kind of keep that going. And what I find very problematic is that there is no critical examination of what these initiatives and these kind of legitimate democratic debates, what the effect of this is on Muslim minorities. There has been a loosely organized Swiss anti-racist movement since the 1970s, but these movements never really centralized the experiences of racialized communities. It has always been very top-down, white left, and very anti-racialist, and that changed last year. So until last year, until Black Lives Matter in Switzerland, the movement, it was very difficult to publicly speak about structural racism in Switzerland. So, for example, a few years ago,
I would stop to talk about the BLM because we are doing.
I know I'm not talking about it.
Okay,
I'm not talking about it. I'm just framing
Please
it. I'll just give a counter example. In the summer months of 2013, there was a village that banned refugees from public places, including the local swimming pool, a church, and the library. There was international media outrage. There was also Oprah Winfrey, who in the same week recounted an experience of racism in a shop in Zurich, and the Swiss media all united to say that this was unfair propaganda and racism hysteria. So in conclusion, anti-racialism is very much the frame through which race and racism are denied in Switzerland. And that would be it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. You really did well, and I guess that after this so nice presentation of a quite complicated argument, the audience will be very glad to have a look at your book, Race in Post-Racial Europe, recently published. So let's move to the third question. So Anders, please, what data is available? What are the methodology usually adopted in documenting racial and ethnic discrimination, like tests, statistics in Sweden?
Yeah, if you can turn off the video or the slide presentation while I answer this, I'll give you two similar to what Stefania was giving from Switzerland. But if you turn off,
yes, we wait so Yvonne to quit the share of her screen so that Anders can use his screen. Thank you.
Do you see something called state budget now?
Yeah.
Just a moment.
I just wanted to show this. This is a slide of the Racist Party election film 2010. And they are portraying how Muslim female migrants are overtaking Sweden. And why I think this is interesting is, the party has I'm trying to find where I am.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, the party has today around 17% in the parliament and so on, and it's really been an effect on the rest of the society. But if we go back to what we know about research, then we can say the classical studies was focused on imputing ethnicity, racialization through registered data based on country of birth. And then especially a lot of survey studies, both often departing from a human capital perspective, where they were trying to show that almost all the difference was linked to difference in human capital, but every time was faced with the problem that they couldn't explain that. And then some of them at least acknowledged that it could be racialized discrimination and so on. Parallel to this, we had a lot of critical studies using qualitative methods, both ethnographic, but also text analysis, showing different forms of racist and racialized discrimination and processes and so on. The last 15 years, we've had a number of so-called field experiments, very much demonstrating the same thing that the qualitative studies have done, that is how pervasive racialized or racist discrimination is in the labor market, in housing, in credit market, and in to a certain extent also I think there are one on schooling and so on. So what we've seen, again, in the same way as I was talking before, we've seen the traditional academia still maintaining more or less the same position that racism isn't a problem in Sweden, but we've seen more and more methodological development, both qualitative but also field experiment, quantitative field experiment, showing how discrimination is quite a substantial aspect of the Swedish society. Thank you.
Many thanks. Finally, we have some good news, some improvement. And so please, Yvonne, in Switzerland, what data is available and what are the methodologies usually adopted documenting racial and ethnic discrimination? We can't hear you yet. We can't hear you, so please put your mic on. And if you want to enlarge the slides, it would be better for the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pia. Okay, in Switzerland, within academia, research on race and racism has a poor standing in both the humanities and social sciences. There are no designated professorships or centers that study racism. There is also a lack of research that scholars working on race and racism face. Further, there is also a lack of quantitative and qualitative data about racism in Switzerland. By Swiss authorities often deploy deeper problematic methodologies that seem to focus on proving that Switzerland does not have a racism problem. For example, Living Together in Switzerland, commissioned by the Swiss authorities, was the first attempt at quantitatively monitoring racism in Switzerland. Respondents were asked if the neighbors' skin color, religion, nationality, or language would matter to them. Only when the respondents said yes to all of these categories, they were classified as racist. Following this categorization, the study found racism is a rare phenomenon in Switzerland. This outcome is arguably the direct product of the very contestable definition and operationalization of racism. Race as a category of analysis, in fact, is rarely used by Swiss researchers. The concept of race seems to be almost a taboo and is blended in favor of the concept of ethnic discrimination. This important idea that race as a signifier draws on historical imaginaries of the order and allows ordering, as Stephanie has written, is rarely used. And this is very important for me to make this point, because to me, this explains why everyday racism is not taken seriously, properly studied and reported. And I think that sometimes speaking from your own experience is the best way to understand racism. So I like to speak about some of my experiences. I usually don't talk about them, but I think it's important to start talking about this. But anyways, as a woman from Colombia, with darker skin than most Swiss, I have experienced several instances of institutional racism. For example, a few years ago, I was in the office of the Foreigners Police in Bern, waiting with my husband for the renewal of our residence permits in Switzerland. After an hour of waiting, the head of the office approached my husband, who is also a foreigner, but he's white and blonde, and apologized for making him wait for so long and invited him into his personal office, where he immediately received the foreigner's permit. I had to wait for another hour and was not served in the boss's office, but in a cubicle by a random civil servant. Another time, I was at the police office in Bern to report the theft of my wallet. The policeman asked me what my profession was, to which I said, Raumplanerin. Raumplanerin is a word in German that means territorial planning. He looked at me with surprise and said, I think you actually mean Raumpflegerin, which in German is a very similar word to Raumplanerin, but it actually means cleaning lady. So to me, these two are important because they illustrate how this historical imaginary of the other, based on the idea of a superior white race and the colonized people as inferior, operates on an everyday basis. It's not simply our experience, it has a historical past, is rooted in imaginaries about the past and founded and based by this idea of white racism. That is to me racism. And I stop here.
Thank you very much. I fully agree. It is so pervasive racism that we should be able to address it from different disciplinary perspective in order to better detect how it works in everyday lives, in the structure, in the system, how many function does racism realize in the society. Unfortunately, it's a perfect device, super functional to the system, and we can find racism everywhere and every time. Let's move to the fourth question. So, Anders, to what extent and which ways has the Black Lives Matter influenced the anti-racist movement in Sweden, please?
Yeah, it's been interesting to see. It's been in difficult times with COVID-19, this last version, but it goes back already to 2030. But in the Swedish case, we can go back further on, because there was quite some, especially left and social democratic mobilizations in support of the civil rights movement in the United States in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s. Vietnam deserters from United States, especially black, were welcomed to Sweden and so on. And why I mention this is because in Sweden, so much of racism has been portrayed as being outside of Sweden. And this has also shaped, in a sense, the discussion or conflict in Sweden linked to Black Lives Matters. So we've seen, and probably for the first time, large manifestations in Sweden that has been dominated by Afro-Swedes that have played, at least visibly, a marginal role in the anti-racist movement in Sweden. So that was quite interesting. Another aspect that followed on that was a widening of racism, and also institutional attempts of employees, students, and so on to build on the feminist Me Too movement to show how racism has affected us in different ways in the everyday life, in bigger and smaller ways, and so on. So, and finally, I would say it's also been a discussion within the broader anti-racist movement about different forms of racism and different forms of racialization, and how to build alliances that have not always been there. And as Stephanie was talking about, I mean, anti-racism in Sweden also started being mainly white, but has developed, and I would say that to a large extent, it's driven by different groups being racialized, but in which black people have been fairly marginal until recently. And then it ends up always with the counter discourse from large strands of the mainstream that this is about racism in the United States. It's different in Sweden. We don't really have racism in Sweden. So that is in a way to capture the Black Lives Matter influence in Sweden the last year and going back a little bit in time. Thanks.
Many thanks, Anders. And now I'm curious about what's happening in Switzerland, Stephanie. So to what extent and which ways has the Black Lives Matter influenced the racist movement?
Yes, so last summer was very much a turning point in the public debate about racism in Switzerland. It was for the first time when we were able to talk about structural racism in Switzerland. It was the first time when Black activists were able to take center stage, had a platform to speak about issues such as racial profiling, everyday racism, and colonial amnesia. Now, however, unfortunately, despite the very laudable coalition politics of the Afro-Swiss movement and them really pointing to not only the Black experience, but also to the experiences of other groups, mainstream political and public discourse has very much failed to link the debate of Black Lives Matter to other forms of structural discrimination or structural racism, particularly anti-Muslim racism and anti-Roma racism, which are very present in public and political discourse. Now, So at the moment, we really see this again because there is this debate about the burqa ban, and it's very difficult to make claims about anti-Muslim racism. This is something that's not being acknowledged as a phenomenon that exists. And what Black Lives Matter has done, however, is it has there is now an increasing call for Black people and people of color to organize themselves, to organize and mobilize politically. And there's just this kind of disconnect still with public discourse, and I hope, and this is also where we hope we see the potential for change, is that Black Lives Matter has kind of destabilized the majoritarian approach to anti-racism that centralizes white, left, middle-class subjects. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So again, we are running out of time a little, so I just move to the next question to Anders. What potential for change do you see in Sweden now?
Yeah, if we go by what's happening the last 10 years, the potential is more and more ethno-nationalism and racism. And it goes both in relation to the migration policies and in relation to integration, inclusion, welfare, and criminal policies. The migrant other, often conceived as the Muslim other, but including Black people, including Roma people, especially, are seen as a threat. And we have, in some municipalities, alliances between the established right-wing parties and cultural racist or racist parties. We have a competition between at least 5 of the 8 parties in the parliament of who can be toughest against migration, against migrants. And migrants and migration is a code word for race in Sweden, and it's become more and more visible because a white migrant that is not racialized as non-Swedish is not considered into the group of migrants when we generally talk about that. We see some resistance, but it's weak. We see it in anti-racist movements. We see it with some civil society support. There are one party, 2 other parties that are fairly vocal against the increase in racism. But it's the situation today is quite strong on expanding racist policy and ethno-nationalism. I showed you a video. If I can get the screen again, then I want to show you a picture that came 2 years ago from the 4th major Swedish daily newspaper. And it's this. And it was an op-ed article that they put a picture that showed that burqa was taking over Sweden. And the research done on this in Sweden is that we generally have somewhere around 500 to perhaps today 1,000 persons in a population of 10 million that are wearing this. But here it was portrayed in a liberal newspaper as a representation of the development of demographies in Sweden and so on. Again, linking migration, racialization, racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. These images really speaks. And now the last question to Yvonne. Yvonne, how could a research community contribute to the change that is definitely needed?
Well, there are...
Anders, we see. Sorry, Anders, we see your screen.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to.
Okay.
I will try to close.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you. Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Many thanks. Well, we think that a critical examination of the theoretical terms that we currently use in migration studies need to be really rethought. Racism is often not named as such. We have the feeling that many scholars deploy anti-racialist logics but do not recognize them as such. I think that Stephanie's important idea of race as a signifier that draws on historical imaginaries of the other and allows ordering has the potential of expanding our limited vision in Switzerland about race. I think this idea, this concept is very important. But I also think there must be open discussions among researchers about why the concept of race is not widely used in Switzerland, particularly in migration studies. I have the impression that the term, as I said before, the term ethnic discrimination is more used. I wonder, or some scholars may ask, that they are reluctant to use the term race because of its connotation with Nazi pseudoscience in Germany. But I also think that the question needs to be raised, and some might fear that this concept of race is a kind of Pandora box that, when opened, might threaten the situation of those who have historically had privileged hiring and employment situations. We also think that the research community needs to seriously think about employment policies in academia. So far, gender exclusion has become a central employment policy, and efforts to include more women in top positions are ongoing. At the same time, the number of non-white and non-European scholars in Swiss academic institutions remains ridiculously low. I am one of the few exceptions. We need to work on making contributions of non-white scholars more visible. Publications from non-white scholars, particularly in countries of the Global South, are rarely read and cited. An intersectional approach is still missing in Swiss employment policies when it comes to questions of equity, inclusion, and diversity in academia. We think that our challenge as scholars is to start thinking and saying aloud that there are kinds of inequalities that remain obscure and that need to be addressed and removed. We need to bring diversity to teaching institutions in Switzerland, thus including non-white scholars and scholars from the global south. This also means supporting students of color, critically looking at structural racism in the Swiss school system, and making sure scholars of color do not leave academia due to institutional racism. And here I stop.
Thank you very much. Yes, there is a lot that the research community should do to move on. Anders, would you like to intervene on this? And then we have a few questions for you.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize again that the university, despite its idea of being outside of society, is part of the society, and thus it will always represent in some way the society in general. And that's why we also see this lack of critical studies on migration, on race, racism, etc., although we also see some critical voices in the university. I think the point I argued that ended really at the beginning of the 1990s of subordinated inclusion in Sweden made it possible for some racialized scholars to enter the academic positions and so on. So in respect to this study field, I would argue that it's less bad when it comes to representation. That is, in the same way that we see in gender studies department an overrepresentation of women, we see in studies of migration and ethnicity in Sweden not a good, but a better representation than in most other places in social science and humanities. So I think there is a base for developing this further on critical perspectives on inequality linked to race, ethnicity, or racialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. So now we are almost at the end of this webinar, and we have some questions from the audience. So first, there's a question for Stephanie. The question is here, I'm reading, it's in the chat. In Portugal, many scholars who work on diversity issues reject the term race and use ethnicity instead, precisely based on this view of race as something that does not exist and does not make sense biologically and scientifically. What is your view on this issue? Personally, I believe this happens because our public debate on racism in Portugal is still very incipient and certainly insufficient. So please, Stephanie, would you like to answer?
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think also what Yvonne said before, many scholars deploy anti-racialist frameworks but don't recognize them as such and also don't understand the limits of those. I think that's also an issue. And I think it shows how academia is not exempt from kind of the general public political discourse. I think that we need to get better at recognizing those logics and questioning those logics.
Thank you, Stephanie. And now there is a question for Anders. How would you characterize this practice of labeling of societal groups that you briefly mentioned in the context of second-generation immigrants? Is there a general, maybe historical pattern of linking racialized groups to migration phenomena in order to exclude groups labeled not real ethnic Swedes? Do you have recommendation on where to start reading about this politics of labeling in Sweden or elsewhere?
Okay, send me an email. I'll give you some references to it. But on the more general, yeah, I think one of the problems with migration studies is that it's been too separated from studies of racism, racialization, race, and so on. Because I think, and I'm not alone thinking, it's not my idea, but I mean, migrants are generally used as a catchword for racialized migrants, whereas others, we have, when white people, and white is historically defined, as we discussed in relation to the Polish going to United States or the Polish going to UK today, it's historically contextualized whiteness. But basically, white migrating are not migrants. It's the others that are migrants. So it becomes a way of talking about race, but without needing to use the term race, which is not very acceptable in mainstream. So yes, I definitely think migration and migrants is a way of racializing large populations. And we see it also in the concept of foreign background. For me, migration or migration is linked to the institutional processes of going from one place to another. And if we recall, migration started out not only with international migration that we take for given, but migration from the countryside to the cities, urbanization processes, and so on. But today, migration, again, has become international migration, but not all international migrants. It's the racialized migrants that are termed migrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is not a question, but for Yvonne, it's words of strong appreciation. Powerful words, Yvonne. Thank you very much for speaking about this. It's from Seren Sengul. So from this comment, I can really say that the webinar was fruitful, and I really thank you a lot for being with us today. And I would like to recall to the audience that there's going to be a third webinar of this series that will be held on March the 2nd, again from 2 to 4, and we are going to speak there with experts from Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and Germany. So hopefully we will have the chance to see again in the future, hopefully physical, maybe at the annual IMISWE conference in Luxembourg. That would be a nice venue where to meet. And thank you very much for your being so passionate and for your insights on such an important issue that definitely we have to take seriously. Thank you a lot, and have a nice evening.